And I'd like to remind folks that this session will be recorded and eventually posted to our website for folks to view later at their convenience. So again, thank you for joining us. We're excited to host our first Dialogues That Matter session, and I will start with going over our land acknowledgement and community guidelines. And so while we are gathered in a virtual space, we always like to begin our events with an acknowledgement of the land that our campus does reside on. So local Indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backward, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on our campus is called Scholars Lane. By day, you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity through campus community members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada. And this is found in our diversity statement. And in order to further ground ourselves in this land and labor acknowledgement, we always leave you with these two reflecting questions to keep in mind, not only during this event, but in your everyday work. What intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? And what is your organization doing beyond acknowledging whose land and labor allow you to live, work, and/or learn in that space? And next, I'd like to review the community agreements that we have. We're all gathered here in a productive and insightful space. And so these are just some points to keep in mind as we discuss this topic. So first, we agree to speak for ourselves and allow others to speak for themselves with no pressure to represent or explain to a whole group. We agree to listen with resilience, hanging in when something is hard to hear. We agree to consider asking a question to check out the assumption we are making rather than taking that assumption as fact. We agree to share airtime and participate within the suggested time frame. We agree to not interrupt except to indicate that we cannot or did not hear a speaker. We agree to pass or pass for now if we're not ready or willing to respond to a question. We agree that when we discuss our experience with people who are not present, we will not attach names or other identifying information to participant comments unless we have permission to do so. And we agree that this is a space of learning, that no one, even the presenters, are able to know all things, and we are all in a constant process of learning. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer, Danya Matos.
Hi, everyone, and good afternoon, UC Merced community. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to uplift a little bit of the announcement when we shared this initiative. As we advance the work of equity, justice, and inclusive excellence, we identified the need to create spaces for you to delve deeper into the emerging national, local, and global issues that undeniably have shaped our campus climate and experiences. We're so excited to announce the launch of this initiative, which is going to continue upon the work of our virtual dialogue series. And I thank each of you who've joined us in that work. These dialogues that matter are community conversations grounded in love. We invite you as students, faculty, staff, postdocs, graduate students, undergraduate students, and of various backgrounds to find bridges, create synergies, and build connections. But most importantly, to explore toolkits that will help you foster more inclusive communities. When I think about that concept of bridges, right, I think about it making that which was once inaccessible, accessible, that which allows us to once was intraversable, traversable, and more importantly, that which was once undescribable, discoverable. And so I thank you for being here for the launch. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our Chancellor, Juan Sanchez Munoz, for welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Associate Chancellor Matos. Good afternoon, all of you, and thank you all for joining us for this critically important discussion, the first in our Dialogues That Matter series. And I would be remiss if I didn't again acknowledge and thank our Associate Chancellor, Danya Matos, for helping to develop the discussion series. And I want to thank our colleagues from Berkeley for joining us today to share their hard-earned wisdom on the topic of anti-Semitism. You heard earlier, but I think it bears repeating, an excerpt from the UC Merced diversity statement, which I hope sets the tone for this, but also future discussions. And I quote, "When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backward, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path to redress for the future." This has particular resonance today as we ponder anti-Semitism past and present, and hopefully address our past wrongs and chart the course of future reconciliation. As most of you know, the campus was troubled in December when a social media account from a member of the campus bearing some very disturbing content was brought to our attention. As the Twitter account included vile messages that crossed the line from criticism of a country and its policies to hateful characterizations of Jewish people. The UC Board of Regents in 2016 made very clear its condemnation of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism. And we believe those messages fit that criteria. The opinions did not represent UC Merced or the University of California. They were abhorrent to me, to many of our colleagues, to many of our neighbors, and they were harmful to the university, our students, and certainly our reputation, and I denounced them, and I continue to do so. As I wrote at the time, we must not let anti-Semitism or any other form of bigotry or hate take root at UC Merced and the community of UC Merced. We must all do better. And I know that we can benefit from the expert assistance that we will hear from during today's dialogue to guide us along that better path. This is why we have invited Professor Katz and Rabbi Naftalin-Kelman to lead us in today's discussion of where anti-Semitism comes from, how to recognize its most insidious forms, and the actions that we must take both individually and collectively to prevent it. And as the youngest and most diverse UC campus, we recognize, as you heard in our statement earlier, we recognize that diversity, justice, and basic humanity are essential components of the world-class scholarship and education and research taking place here. We owe the world and ourselves both an understanding of the perils that we face, and more importantly, or as importantly, the courage to face them honestly, intellectually. I have great hope that for today's dialogue, and that it brings us closer to both of those goals. And I look forward to today's discussion and thank all of you for participating.
Well, Chancellor, thank you. With that, I'll turn it back over to Hala.
Thank you, Danya. And before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to give a quick thank you to the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, which helped sponsor our Dialogues That Matter series. And so to give a quick intro to our speakers, Dr. Ethan Katz is an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at UC Berkeley. Ethan Katz was educated at Amherst College and the University of Wisconsin. Since the fall of 2018, he has been associate professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's also the vice chair of the Chancellor's Committee on Jewish Life and Campus Climate. Since the spring of 2019, he's been the co-founder and co-director of the Anti-Semitism Education Initiative at Berkeley, along with Rabbi Naftalin-Kelman. And Rabbi Adam Naftalin-Kelman is the executive director at UC Berkeley Hillel. He has been the executive director since 2009. Before coming to Berkeley Hillel, he served as the director of Hillel at the University of Colorado at Boulder, upon completing his rabbinic studies at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. He attended the University of Rhode Island, where he studied accounting and management information systems. And upon completion of college, he began work for Arthur Andersen as a business consultant. He currently sits on several committees with Hillel International Advising on issues of campus climate as it relates to Jewish life and Jewish students on campus. Adam currently lives in Berkeley with his partner and 3 sons. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our 2 speakers.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that really warm welcome. We're extremely honored to be doing the inaugural event in your Dialogues That Matter series. Really just delighted that you've taken up anti-Semitism in such a serious way as part of this series, and really looking forward to learning with you and dialoguing with you. We very much share the spirit of one of the things, all the things that were mentioned in your principles, and in particular the fact that even as presenters we're always learning, and every time we do these presentations we learn from the questions and comments of people who are in the audience. So one of the things that we always say at the outset is that you really should feel comfortable asking us anything. We're going to do a little icebreaker exercise in a few minutes that Adam's going to lead, but I just want to underscore that we really want this to feel like a safe space. We have heard every possible question and comment that could be brought. We really want people to come to these conversations with the sense that the thing on their mind they don't know how to ask, or the thing they heard from someone about such and such that they've always wondered about, but they thought it wasn't polite to say or ask, that this is the space where they can do that. So we really just encourage you to explore, because we want you to walk away from this with a sense of new understanding and breaking through barriers that are difficult to break through, not only in our conversations with each other, but mental barriers that are difficult to break through. And I also just want to say, Adam and I, we both have very diverse experiences across the Jewish world, across the Jewish community. We don't claim to speak for the Jewish community writ large, or for all Jews or anything like that. But we bring a lot of different perspectives, and that means we also bring self-critical perspectives about some of the hard parts of these issues. And that's one of the reasons that we'll point some of those out in the course of the presentation, but it's also a reason that we welcome challenging and difficult questions. So it was mentioned a little bit, we have been working together on this anti-Semitism initiative now for about a year and a half at UC Berkeley, and we have created training that we do here, some other programming and training, and our basic goal is to help people come into conversations where there are issues related to Jewish life, Jewish history, Jewish politics, sometimes the state of Israel, with a more informed set of understandings, with a knowledge of what anti-Semitism has been historically and how it manifests itself today. And so that's the spirit with which we started the initiative, and that's the spirit with which we go into these conversations. I think I'm going to turn things over now to Adam for an icebreaker.
Great, thanks, Ethan. So we're actually in the middle of the Jewish holiday of Passover, and there's a part of this holiday that we get to where there are 4 children that represent possibilities of 4 ways of asking questions. And in fact, there's a part of this holiday which was celebrated called the Seder, which was on Saturday night and Sunday night. And the whole premise of the Seder is to probe the children sitting around the table, to ask questions, to give an opening for parents to talk about liberation and freedom and moving from slavery. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask that we try to go through this exercise. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'd like for everybody to change their screen name to UC Merced in order to create a sense of anonymity going forward. So if everybody could take just a moment, if you're able to change your name to UC Merced. Should be able to just click on the 2 dots of your screen and rename. Hopefully we're all Zoom experts at this point. Give people another minute. Okay, and what I'll ask for people to do is whether you've changed your name. Yeah.
You might want to quickly explain for people.
Sure.
Who have a hard
So the reason that we're going to be changing, I'm asking people to change their names. You don't have to participate, but the idea is that sometimes we may be uncomfortable asking a question, but we want to ask that question, but we don't want someone to necessarily know. In our tradition, Judaism, we have a phrase that the embarrassed one will not learn. So sometimes I want to create a setting where people can ask whatever they want. So if we change our name, you change it to UC Merced, you can ask whatever you want. If you can't change it and you want to ask the question, you can also ask your question. You have no fear.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. I'm not sure our Zoom settings had allowed that, so I was trying to ask the team, but they all changed their names, so I don't know who I'm messaging.
If you click on your name, then there should be an option to scroll down to click on rename.
Yep. If you just click on the three dots, it says something that says if you're able to rename. So, and if you can't, that's okay. You can still participate in this. It just gives an opportunity if you're not as comfortable asking a question. I'd love for everybody in the chat. I want you to, if you're comfortable, to just ask a question you've always wondered or wanted to ask about anti-Semitism, but may never had the opportunity, either because the setting wasn't appropriate or someone shut you down, or you just didn't know the person and you wanted to ask it. A burning question you've always wanted to ask about anti-Semitism. So people can put that in the chat and go ahead and hit enter. That'd be great. Take about 30 seconds for that. Give another 15 or 20 seconds to write a question in the chat. Any question you've always wanted to ask about anti-Semitism.
Could also be just a question that you have that you really hope you'll get answered in this training. You know, maybe that question only occurred to you as you were thinking about coming here today.
Great. So we'll give another 10 seconds. So some of these questions we're going to cover in the presentation. There's always the question about this, how it relates with Israel. We're definitely going to spend some time around that. Okay, so these are great, really great guides for Ethan and myself that we will also make sure to cover. Some of them we have in our presentation, but it also gives us some helpful guides about areas that people are interested in that we can focus on. There seems to be several questions about the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism, which is something that Ethan and I are talking a lot. And I'll just give a quick plug that Ethan is helping organize or is organizing a presentation about this in particular, about Blacks and Jews and some of the racism and overlap around anti-Semitism with Eric Ward. So we'll give you that information at the end as well. Okay, so if people are comfortable, you can change your name back. And we're gonna get started. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Just gonna jump in, and one of the things that this is an earlier a question is that anti-Semitism, we need to address this along with other hatreds to build an inclusive community. And I'll just go ahead and read this because it's an important statement, is that to build an inclusive community, we need to understand others and recognize that certain behaviors around other people are not acceptable. Actions that diminish an individual identity, enforce stereotypes, are hateful in the nature and are not welcome. And this is for UC Berkeley, and I would say the same as UC Merced. There are many communities that are taking steps to eliminate such behavior. And one example is that Jewish students here and Jewish students everywhere and faculty and staff are, how do we address the anti-Semitism that may be experiencing on campuses? So this is our attempt in terms of how we're going to do that. And the beginning part, as Ethan has shared earlier, is our basis of what we're doing is we are educational institutions. We approach this from a place of education, that we really need to, many of the incidents that happen oftentimes come from a place of not knowing. And our goal is to first, how do we make sure people understand the historical understandings of anti-Semitism? And some of the things that have been seen, at least on the Berkeley campus, these are some examples. And we're actually gonna workshop these at the end. How is this anti-Semitic? Is it anti-Semitic? What are the things in this that characterize it as anti-Semitic? But these are examples that we've seen today, of which that were they were on the UC Berkeley campus, and some may have been also on the UC Merced campus. So in order to start, we're going to go back. Before we even talk about anti-Semitism, it's critical just to get a basic understanding of Judaism. What is Judaism? So Judaism, as we see here, it's 3,500 years old. It is the first religion to embrace monotheism, the idea of a singular God. It is the oldest Abrahamic religions. It stems from the Old Testament. Jews refer to that Old Testament as the Torah. And in terms of the Abrahamic religions, we have two other Western Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam. And Judaism is this oldest Abrahamic religion. We have overlapping stories in this Old Testament. And Judaism is the expression or the name of the religion of the Jewish people. Today, as I'll go into a little bit more detail, we have many movements, many expressions. Like many other religions we have today, you have multiple expressions of a religious, of different religious identities and different religious behaviors. The reality is, the religion, it's a religion, right? Judaism, at the same time, it's a cultural expression. Sometimes Jews will see themselves as an ethnicity. They see themselves as a unique community. And with it comes different traditions. And with it as well, Judaism is a land-based Judaism that I'll talk a little bit later on, that goes back to, as we're celebrating now, the exodus from Egypt and into what was known as the promised land of Canaan, which in today is what we see of today is Israel. In a nutshell, the fact that Jews and Judaism, it dates back 3,500 years, is still here, has had many oppressions, has had many successes, has waxed and waned, and has been all over the world. And it has adapted to many things that have happened over time. It's incredibly complicated, right? Anything that's lasted for 3,500 years, you can imagine, and is morphed over that time. But go back 3,500 years ago, the Jews and Judaism 3,500 years ago would not recognize what Judaism is today, and yet we connect ourselves to the tradition that was passed down. So who are the Jewish people? In a nutshell, the Jewish people are individuals that adhere to the faith, a part of these people of Judaism. We are individuals that span the world through millennium, and we see ourselves as a common story and narrative. And I say that as a common story and narrative is because we're in this midst, actually, in Passover. It's apropos that we share this presentation now, is we're telling that story. There is this narrative that we continue to tell. We share a common system of thought, beliefs, and behaviors. And all of these different beliefs and behaviors have changed and developed over time, depending on where the Jews were. There are certainly similar thoughts and similar practices, and those continue today, but there is enormous variability among those beliefs and behaviors that we will see. In fact, Ethan and I may have similar backgrounds, may present in a similar way, but our traditions that have been passed down from family may be different, and how we express it. So while the core and the belief may be there, how it is expressed, in some ways, it's no different than other religious traditions. Many Jews will see themselves as an ethnic group, and with it, there comes a specific food, specific language, stories that are told, customs that they practice, and they are oftentimes tied to the tradition of religious practice. Not always, but oftentimes it can be linked to the practices that can date back millennia ago. So whether or not we have a religious or political or cultural or loosely spiritual, many Jews, they still feel a connection, though, to a land. And this is important, is that over time, Jews and the Jewish people originated a millennia ago in the Fertile Crescent. Over times and in ancient times, the Jews established a kingdom in what Jews called at that time the land of Israel, Israel being the name of Jacob, the biblical figure, which was just a quick rundown is there was Abraham. Abraham had a son, Isaac. Isaac then had a son, Jacob. And Jacob also had another name called Israel. That is the origin of this. And the land today, Jews call the land today the land of Israel. And in that area, they established a temple in Jerusalem today. And that temple was the center of the Jewish people at that time, a millennia ago. The temple served as a gathering place. It was an opportunity from Jews from the region, but also beyond, throughout that Fertile Crescent, to gather, to celebrate holidays and specifically to observe the temple rites that were part of that were partly outlined in the Bible, or the 5 books of Moses. After the destruction of the Second Temple and the expulsion of the expulsion of Jews and the Jewish people from that land in 70 CE, the Jews began residing and building communities throughout the entire region and beyond. And as Jews began to establish themselves in these communities, they began to pick up subtleties and change some of the subtleties of their practices, and their behaviors adapted to the world around them. An example I use is today that we have wedding ceremonies for Jews have some core parts, but they also take on and have taken on the different parts of the regions where Jews arose. We fast forward to part of the Enlightenment and some of the Reformation, and the idea of Jews as separate from a religion was very different. Jews were known as a nation, as a people, and it wasn't until really the modern Reformation where there was this idea of separating a Jewish people as a nation to a religion. And what ends up happening is that there is an identity crisis that evolves among Jews that we, as I will say, as a people still struggle with whether or not we are a people or whether or not we are a religion. And many Jews will say we are both, and they will articulate it and define it very differently depending on who you're talking to. And the reason I say this is that it's incredibly important to understand how that has evolved. And for Jews, it's actually quite a modern phenomenon. And we are still struggling as a people to understand how we mix between both being a people and also a religion, and being in a place in particular like the United States, where many times we have been accepted potentially as a people. We still share this sometime uncomfortableness being a people, but also a religion. And we'll get to how this manifests in anti-Semitism today, and in particular, how it's manifested in the United States as it deals with Jews and the Jewish people. Jewish people, as a result of this diaspora of the spreading out of the destruction of the temple and Jews moving everywhere, we look like people all over the world. You have Jews in Ethiopia, you have Jews in China and Cuba. We are essentially, as Jews, the multiplicity and diversity of people throughout the world and humankind. So, and just as I said, we look that way, we also have changed our traditions to adapt to the place that we are living at that time. In terms of the Jewish population, oftentimes I'll ask individuals, and maybe I'll ask this, maybe people can put in the chat, Jews make up a tiny fraction of the world population. So this is a little bit of an old population study, but just to give a sense, there are 6.9 billion people in the world. Jews make up 14.5 million. It is a 0.2% of the world population. And this is an important understanding and statistic to know, because there are many tropes, as Ethan is going to talk about, is this idea of Jewish power and control. And what's critical to understand is it is a blip on the screen in terms of the world population. And in fact, what is happening now is, I think just over or right around half of the Jews today reside in only Israel today. So we have that statistic here. You can see this population, 6.3 million. So just over a majority of Jews, which just switched over recently, reside in Israel today. Now going to turn it over to Professor Katz, that will, now that we have a background and an understanding of Judaism, the Jewish people, the complexity, hopefully, of that, look at some of the underpinnings and anti-Semitism today.
Yeah, so now that Adam gave you that terrific 101 rundown of Judaism and Jewish culture, Jewish people, we're going to dive right into the question of anti-Semitism. And the first thing to say about what is anti-Semitism is it's complicated. It's a topic of considerable debate today in and beyond the Jewish community, how best to define anti-Semitism. But one starting point that's crucial is to think broadly about what is discrimination, what is oppression that's targeted toward a specific group, right? And when we attribute a quality to a person or a group simply because of the group that they're part of, that's a form of discrimination, right? And anti-Semitism, in the broadest sense, is discrimination against Jews. It can be discriminatory behavior, discriminatory ideas that are expressed in writing or verbally, discriminatory acts that can, at their most extreme, take violent and lethal forms. But it is singling out Jews as Jews, right? It is disliking or having negative attitudes or behaviors toward Jews because they are Jewish. So there's some useful guidelines here for identifying anti-Semitism. As I say, it's a perception, belief, or behavior that's hostile to Jews based on the fact that they are Jewish. Anti-Semitism often is a conspiracy theory. If you boil it down and you look at a lot of expressions about Jews that either are overtly anti-Semitic or maybe make you or someone you know uncomfortable, it's because the assumption behind what's being said is that Jews are somehow conspiring to take over something or to do harm, or that Jews are behind what is going wrong, right? Anti-Semitism can take the form of religious teachings, and we'll talk in a moment about the religious origins of what we today call anti-Semitism. It can also be a political effort to isolate or injure Jews, a system that disadvantages Jews in a systematic way. And it can be expressed, as I already alluded to, in speech and writing. It can be through art, and it often employs very negative stereotypes about Jewish character traits, about Jewish physical traits. This history of these stereotypes is one of the areas that we're going to focus on the most, because if you want to understand contemporary anti-Semitism and figure out where we can identify anti-Semitism, we have to know about these historical prejudices, these particular stereotypes that have been used repeatedly over the ages about Jews. And oftentimes anti-Semitism, of course, does not target explicitly a person or even a group of people, but instead targets a Jewish institution, or sometimes an institution that's not Jewish, but that's associated with Jews, or is blamed for some connection to Jews. So anti-Semitism can take many different forms, and I want to stress that context is often really crucial for identifying when a given act or a given expression is anti-Semitic. There are cases where the same thing can be said by a person or a group in context A, and it is clearly anti-Semitic, and in context B, it doesn't seem like it's anti-Semitic. So one of the things that we'll really focus on, especially when we get to the discussion around anti-Semitism and its relationship to debates around Israel, is when can we figure out that there's a context where something is going on that we would identify as anti-Semitism. Let's go to the next slide. So here we're going to talk about a brief history of how anti-Semitism developed, right? Anti-Semitism, what we call anti-Semitism today, and we'll speak a little bit about how anti-Semitism as a term is only popularized in the 19th century. But what we call anti-Semitism today originates as anti-Judaism, as a religious set of ideas about Jews on the part of early Christians. And it originates with tremendous hostility toward the fact that Christianity emerges, of course, out of Judaism. It emerges first as a sect of Judaism. And the fact that a core group of Jews resists the move to Christianity generates a lot of frustration and hostility on the part of some early Christians, and eventually accusations that Jews are the great obstacle to everyone accepting Jesus Christ. And that morphs then into the false and still very persistent claim that Jews murdered Jesus Christ, right? And so that will then manifest itself as a broader accusation of tremendous Jewish hostility toward Christianity and toward Christians. False claims that Jews poison the communion wafer, destroy the communion wafer, just like the claim was they had destroyed the body of Christ when he was alive. Claims that Jews poison wells, and this is a very prevalent claim during the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, where there are massacres of Jews accused of carrying out the Black Plague. Claims that Jews do something that we now refer to as the blood libel, the idea that Jews murder Christian children and use their blood to make ritual foods. One of the most commonly made accusations is actually about Passover matzah. Right? As absurd as this accusation is, it has been very persistent and has recurred through the ages up to modern times. This also already in the Middle Ages takes the form of the accusation that Jews were financially exploiting their Christian neighbors. In the Middle Ages, Jews had limitations on the professions that they could practice. Jews begin in this time to be disproportionately involved in merchant and financial sectors of the economy. And in that context, Jews are accused of unfair practices as moneylenders or as merchants that are based, the accusations based on the idea, again, that Jews are inherently hostile to their Christian neighbors. So what we see is then Jews in hundreds of cities across Europe from about 1100 to 1800. If I could show you, it would be staggering to you if you could see the number of communities from which Jews are expelled across the continent of Europe in that time, in many cases more than once. And it generally comes from these sorts of accusations that I've just described, accusations about poisoning wells, about attacking Christian rituals, about financial exploitation, about the blood libel. And this is the sort of long history of anti-Judaism that is all pre-modern and that is built into really the fabric of Western civilization in the same way as certain other prejudices and hatreds. It's a hard thing for us to understand, and it's a hard thing to really grapple with, but it is sort of there as a reservoir. And we have to realize that because pieces of that reservoir, right, get dipped into at various moments in our contemporary politics, and the anti-Semitic ideas are all there. They're all there in, as I say, sort of the DNA of our civilization, and they originate from ancient times. Let's go on. So what we call anti-Semitism today is called that because in the 19th century, anti-Semitism emerges as something called anti-Semitism, and it emerges as no longer a set of religious ideas, but a racial hatred. For all of their vehemence and virulence and at times lethality, the ideas of the anti-Jewish hostilities of the Middle Ages and the early modern era, because they were religiously based, theoretically, and in some cases practically, Jews could convert to Christianity to get out of being accused, to get out of being disadvantaged, right? Once it becomes a racial ideology in the late 19th century, along with a series of other racial ideas, interconnected with a series of other racial ideas, then it's biological. Then you can do nothing. It is immutable, right? If you are labeled as a Jew, or I'll explain it in a moment, as a Semite, then that is who you are, and there's nothing you can do to change that. So we know something about the rise of a series of forces in the 19th century. Orientalist thinking, right? Stereotypes about people from the East or from exotic places. The rise of colonial empires, efforts to conquer large parts of the world and to subjugate peoples there who were considered to be inferior or dangerous or both. We know about the rise of something called race science associated with eugenics and other forms of often pseudoscience that did things like measuring the size of craniums of people of allegedly different races in order to talk about racial hierarchies. All those things are happening in the late 19th century. And while they are targeting a series of groups, one of the central groups that are being targeted are Jews. Often other groups are being targeted outside, sometimes far outside the West, far outside the continent of Europe, whereas Jews are generally being attacked within Europe as the primary other of European civilization at this time. And anti-Semitism comes from the idea that Jews were a Semitic race from Asia, and that they pose this grave danger to the nation and to progress. The term anti-Semitism is popularized by a German political figure named Wilhelm Marr, who founds the Anti-Semitic League in Germany in 1879. And he says that the purpose of anti-Semitism is to cleanse Germany of the corrosive and undue influence of Jews, which poses a grave obstacle to the progress of the German nation. So it's a term that's coined with pride by Wilhelm Marr, and it's coined specifically related to Jews. When the term Semitic was used by racial thinkers, it included Jews, it sometimes included Arabs, it included other peoples who were considered Asiatic. But when anti-Semitism is coined as a term, it is meant very much explicitly to be about hatred of Jews, not generally about those other groups. It's also important to understand that anti-Semitism, while we think of it in its 19th century form as a right-wing ideology, it really reflected ideas from across the political spectrum. There were different forms of anti-Semitism already in the 19th century. It included socialist ideas that blamed Jews for the evils of capitalism. It included liberal ideas that blamed Jews for economic downturn. It included perceptions that Jews were the obstacle to various forms of social progress. We see here a popular Catholic daily from the 1930s called Social Justice. And right there on the front, the Jewish question, one of the central preoccupations of this newspaper called Social Justice, was the alleged Jewish problem in America. Let's go to the next slide. So anti-Semitism also in the 19th century spreads to the Middle East, right? It becomes no longer confined to the continent of Europe, to Western thinkers, through a series of accusations about the blood libel, right? The idea that Jews murder Christians and use their blood for rituals. It spreads to places like Syria and Turkey and Rhodes and various places across the Middle East where suddenly ideas about Jews that are racial or that are connected to ancient Christian hostility toward Jews spread for the first time. And this is over time going to have a significant impact on the way that certain Muslim thinkers regard Jews. Let's go to the next slide. The ultimate culmination of anti-Semitism in Europe in the modern era was in the Holocaust, right? Nazi Germany, with its leader Adolf Hitler, from 1933 to 1945, carries out a campaign intended to exterminate Jews from the continent of Europe, if not the planet. And they murder 6 million Jews in the course of that time. It's important to understand this is not an attack on Jewish armies. This is not an attack on Jewish resistors. This is an attack on innocent Jewish men, women, and children who are taken from their homes, who are put into cattle cars and sent to concentration camps, or who are shot in Eastern Europe by mass killing units in various towns and villages. And this horrific episode, of course, weighs deeply on the Jewish conscience to this day, but it did not mark the end of anti-Semitism. And it's also important to recognize while the Nazis, that is the government and army of one country, were the lead perpetrators, they were only able to carry out such a vast number of killings with the cooperation of millions of people actively and passively across Europe. So we often think also about what would have happened if more people had stood up during the Holocaust. And this informs our focus on what we all can do to stand up against anti-Semitism and other hatreds today. Go to the next slide. After the Holocaust, anti-Semitism did not sadly go away, as we know. This is why we're here. And the United States, before the war and after World War II, was not a stranger to anti-Semitism. Social anti-Semitism, as it's often called, was extremely common in the United States, even when my parents were growing up. There were numerous country clubs, universities, social clubs that either excluded Jews, places that had signs, that said no Jews, blacks, or dogs, for instance. And there were many places that had quotas about the number of Jews that they would allow, severe restrictions, so they didn't have, quote, too many Jews. And certain anti-Semitic figures, like the popular leader, Father Coughlin. We saw the news magazine of his movement, Social Justice, a few minutes ago. He's pictured here in the middle. In the 1930s, for years, roughly 30 million people a week would tune in to hear his radio broadcasts every week. And these were filled with anti-Semitic screeds blaming the Jews for all kinds of problems. So historically, as at present, sadly, America has not been a stranger to anti-Semitism. So I'm just going to finish this segment by going through many of them I've already referred to in different ways. What are the core stereotypes against Jews historically? And these are so important really to try to internalize if you want to understand and recognize anti-Semitism in our midst today and be able to try to address it, right? So as I said, conspiracy theories about Jews. There's an accusation in a very famous document in the early 20th century called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that a series of rabbis are planning a world takeover. Unfortunately, that document still gets reprinted in various languages in various countries to this day and is believed to be the gospel truth, even though it was long ago proven to be a complete forgery. There are accusations about Jews running the financial system or running Hollywood, right? These are all versions of an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The image of Jews as traitors, that Jews are disloyal, that Jews have dual loyalties, questions we hear sometimes in American politics. Oh, you're Jewish. Does that mean you have dual citizenship with the state of Israel? Or you're Jewish. Can you really make decisions about America and Israel since you must have divided loyalties, right? This idea that Jews are more loyal to their own somehow than they are to each other. And one image of Jews as traitors is Judas, which refers to Judas Iscariot and his role in the murder of Jesus Christ. Let's go to the next. So this brings me to this very persistent false accusation that Jews murdered Jesus Christ, right? That is still very much with us. It plays out as a metaphor in some contexts of anti-Semitism, and it's something to always be aware of. There's a broader association between Jews and the devil, or Jews and evil forces. So we have here very powerful images, right? On top, we have a classic image of Jews actually murdering Jesus. And on the bottom, we have this image of Jews as the devil, right? These are unfortunately not unusual images. You can find many more like them. A slightly more subtle form of anti-Semitism is the notion that Judaism is an outmoded religion that's entombed in ancient, outmoded customs and is the great obstacle either to Christianity and the redemption of Christianity or to the full spread of human rationalism and progress across the world, right? Again, the blood libel, it's still with us. This accusation that Jews carry out ritual murders, such as slaughtering children and using their blood to make Passover matzah. And we have the idea, we have really very persistent ideas about Jewish power, right? The idea that despite their small numbers, often through alleged conspiracies, Jews have enormous power. They control governments. They are acting like a puppeteer over global markets or over various governments. And you look at these images here. These are very frequently widespread images. The one in the middle is a mural from only a few years ago. And they all show Jews either having tremendous control in some, very exaggerated physical form, like the one here on the right, or the one here on the left with all these tentacles, or they show Jews sitting together with incredible financial or governmental power in their hands as they gather to use that. And this bleeds into the second one on this slide, which is this very strong association between Jews and materialism, greed, and money. In some ways, this goes all the way back to the Middle Ages and the fact that Jews were disproportionately in financially related professions and became resented and accused of financial exploitation in connection to larger stereotypes about Jews as anti-Christian. And finally, we have these kind of really grotesque stereotypes about Jews that associate them with medical afflictions, with infirmity, with filth, with sexual deviance, images of Jews as leeches, as insects. We see here, on the right side, we see this Jew as a caterpillar, again, with extraordinary power, right, like crawling across the globe. And on the left, we see a classic example of an unmistakable way that a critique of Israel becomes anti-Semitic, where you have a caricature of a grotesque-looking spider here with a big Jewish star on it, reaching out across parts of the Middle East in a very menacing-looking way, right? We can see here the way that a kind of really grotesque and really disgusting imagery about Jews, unfortunately, is a widespread part of anti-Semitic stereotypes.
Okay, so Ethan has given us an amazing background, a quick but detailed background about this idea of where did anti-Semitism come from? And we're going to jump to really today and what does it look like in manifest? And I want to start with how did Jews and race fit together? And as Ethan said, as it started with an anti-Jewish quality in terms of early Christianity, it really morphed after Wilhelm popularized this idea of a race idea. But what needs to be understood beforehand is that Jews for millennia have thought of themselves as a nation. What that looks like, separate from a nation as we think of a country today, but as a nation or as a people, which is unusual. We don't really have things as a whole, but they saw themselves as a people that were connected in some way. So that brings us to today. And one of the things that's important to just name at the outset is race is a total social construct. We get that today. We understand that it's a social construct. Bearing that in mind, Jews, and this is in particular we're really focusing a lot more on the United States, but Jews, like other European groups that immigrated to the US, they attempted to assimilate into American society, to become part of the melting pot, as we talked about, to be part of all of the benefits. We have the American dream of being part of and being fully included. They tried to do that. And in many ways, they took that path and they looked to be accepted, even though oftentimes, as Ethan said, in their early 50s and 30s and 40s, they were excluded, but in many ways they were accepted. And in many ways, they benefited from much of the anti-Black racism that exists today and existed then, that they were in some ways accepted and were able to benefit from things like many of their European counterparts. And at the same time, Jews also suffered significant discrimination that were similar to the non-European immigrants at that time. And as Ethan said, the quotas, the exclusion of Jews from restaurants, the exclusion of Jews from being part of a social group, exclusion from higher ed and academics. So the Jews were occupying this interesting space. And in particular, when there was mass immigration of Jews from Europe and Eastern Europe before World War II, you have a lot of European Jews coming in and trying to assimilate, similar to many other Europeans at that time, and suffering these two things. They're somewhat accepted and trying to copy the behaviors as Jews had done for millennium. They established synagogues. Many of those synagogues looked like the churches at that time. They joined those synagogues in the way that individuals joined churches. And at the same time, so they benefited from all of those things. At the same time, they were discriminated against. And you see that in what's happening here is that white nationalists will see Jews, for Jews, they are not considered white. And when I say this word white, I think of white as this idea of benefit, of privilege, of wealth, of power, of being accepted. It's not inherently the idea of a color of a skin. For the white nationalists, Jews are not white. It doesn't matter how they look, it doesn't matter who they are. They are not part of their white rubric. And for these groups, the Jews are actually part of this conspiracy to replace those white nationalists' majority. And we see this graphic on the head, ending white privilege, right? The Jews are here, they're trying to take away the white majority. So if the Jews are trying to take away the white majority, they are not part of this white group for them. And no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, their white looking skin as they might be from Europe, it's actually what makes them even more nefarious than someone that looks different. Why? Because they can be, right, a conspiracy. They can go undercover and actually work the system because they look like you and me. And that, you can imagine, if you're in the mind of a conspiracy theory, it only builds, right? Look at those white Jews. We can't exclude them. They're trying to replace who we are. It's all part of those tropes, as Ethan had said earlier, of these conspiratorial ideas of Jews trying to take over this power. So those are white nationalists. For other activists, Jews are only white. They are only part of the privilege and power of society. And in critical perspectives on whiteness, they emphasize the way that being white has granted Jews all of this power, all of this privilege. They can't understand who we are as a minority. So in one hand, you have these white nationalists that will never accept Jews as this privilege or power in a healthy way. And then you have a whole nother set of activists and anti-Semitic individuals that see Jews only as part of the power and privilege, regardless of what their skin looks like. So if we look at today, Jews in America, there's something like 12 to 15% of Jews in America today identify themselves as Jews of color, many of which came from Middle Eastern or African descent. But even those individuals are simply part of the white power, and they are not part of necessarily a multiplicity of identities in terms of Jews of color. So it complicates things, is that Jews look every shade and color, and at the same time, depending on who you're talking to, some individuals will put Jews as part of the excluded conspiratorial place. They're not part of our majority of white. And other people will say Jews are only part of that. You can imagine, you get sandwiched in this, and this happened. This is not a new phenomenon. And as Ethan talked about earlier, this happened also in the early 20th century and late 19th century. The Jews were in this sort of middle ground. And this one idea is that Jews occupy a really complicated place for the racial position in America. If you are standing next to somebody, any individual, and they consider themselves Jewish, that individual, for some people, they are going to see that person, they'll see her as simply white, and they're part of the power, they're part of the privilege that we are fighting against, they're part of helping raise up the oppression, where they're part of that we need to bring down. But that same Jew, another person will see that exact same person racially as other non-white, whose power actually is a threat to who they are and is actually illegitimate. So you can imagine that same person looking exactly the same way is incredibly complex on both how they're seen, but also how they see themselves and how they walk through America today. And one thing to understand, and I think this is apropos significantly for Jews, is that Jews have this unique and strange place. And this idea is that white, for many Jews, it's not simply a color of a skin, but there is an idea of the whiteness is an idea potentially is coded for privilege and power. And that's something that I think we talk about, we understand, but Jews are in this weird place around being both a minority, we'll talk about this a little bit later, is having sometimes more representation, but yet they're still a minority. So we look at today, what does white nationalist anti-Semitism look today? It's what many of us might be familiar with. It jumps out at us. It seems to be really clear, right? It's a major, Jews are a preoccupation for people. It's nostalgic of Hitler. It uses many of the signs and rhetoric of Nazi Germany in World War II. So two of these things, they have a swastika. White man, are you tired of the Jews, right? We need to get rid of them. The Jews are taking our power. And again, this is white man, and it means the Jews are not white. Don't be fooled by what they look like. They're not white. You have another thing that says, my love for you burns like this should be 6 million Jews, right? Adolf Hitler. And you have another sign here, a Star of David, a conspiratorial idea of 9/11. Jews were actually behind 9/11, right? Many of these groups are fixated. They are thinking that Jews are actually trying to take away, right? This racial integration. And it goes as far as that it's, like I said, it's even worse than, let's say, a group of individuals that just want to stand up against any kind of white majority. The Jews are worse because they're white, they look white, and they're trying to connive and make their way into society. And today, what do we have today? We have white nationalists. What are some of the things that happen? And in fact, we haven't updated this, but we have pictures also of January 6th, of the riot on the Capitol. We have anti-Semitic, classic white nationalist anti-Semitic. I'll show you a video in a second, but you have this chanting in Charlottesville, Jews, you will not replace us. In the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2008, right? The individual said, open your eyes. It's the filthy, evil Jews bringing the filthy, evil Muslims into the country, right? The Jews are actually bringing in people that we also hate. And then lastly, the Poway Synagogue, the individual had an open letter, and in it he said, meticulously planned genocide of the European race, right? That's what the Jews are trying to do. They're trying to kill the European race, right? These are all conspiratorial things. I'll just show this short video, which is incredibly graphic. And for me, what's important is this is not an individual saying something. This is a group of people.
Hello, everyone.
Oh,
this is
just going to fast forward real quickly.
Take my word for it. Let's listen to the rest of what they have to say.
And this is
we'll start off by hearing a few of their chants. So 2 chants from the Torch rally there.
So this was in Charlottesville, and as what's important, I think, that Ethan had shared is that there is an element that will always be part of, certainly Jews today, of the ethos of the trauma of a Holocaust and seeing certain things. Whether or not, right, as we know from trauma, logic doesn't work. And this is always something that is occupying much of, or many Jews today. And you see this chant, not an individual saying, I don't like Jews, but this is a group chanting, Jews will not replace us, will not replace the white majority. I'm going to pass it back over to Ethan to now move into Israel and Zionism, some of your questions you had and how that ties into anti-Semitism.
Thanks, Adam. Just as a quick sort of add-on to the points that Adam was just making there about white nationalists, to address something that was brought up in some of the chat questions, we see really very vividly with the white nationalist right today that the figure of the Jew, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hostility is inseparable from other types of hatreds, right? When they see Jews behind immigration that they oppose, when they see Jews behind the presence of Muslims in America, or when they see Jews behind forces in the African-American community that they say racist things about, right? You see there that anti-Semitism can't be separated for white supremacists from these other hatreds. So it's a very powerful example of intersectionality. And it's worth highlighting that in both of those violent attacks in Pittsburgh in October 2018 and in Poway in April of 2019, that rhetoric that Adam highlighted so well there, that rhetoric is explicitly about Jews as the kind of master conspirators that are supporting other minority groups who those figures or movements oppose. Shifting gears to what is another very charged area for trying to understand contemporary anti-Semitism, we move to the Middle East and the area of Israel-Palestine, right? And first, want to try to give a really quick distillation of the Zionist movement, because Zionism is frequently spoken about, and it's spoken about with a lot of misperceptions oftentimes. Zionism at its core emerges out of two major forces. One is a very long-standing sense of ongoing attachment to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem in particular on the part of Jews across millennia. You always had a small population of Jews that remained in historic Palestine. In the 19th century, when Jews start to return in larger numbers, there were probably 20 or 25,000 Jews on the eve of that living in what was at that time Palestine. And so in prayers and in all kinds of aspects of Jewish culture, that remains there. Modern Zionism connects itself to that, but also takes the form directly of a response to anti-Semitism, a response to the fact that integrating into European culture, in some ways for the very types of reasons that Adam just talked about, of Jews always being constantly in between and never fully accepted and never seen as fully of the white majority in many European countries, integration is not as easy as Jews hoped it would be. There are periodic bouts of anti-Semitism. And in the face of the rise of anti-Semitism in the 19th century, Zionism is a new solution to the so-called Jewish question, the question of how Jews will or will not be integrated into European society. And it is a movement to create a sovereign state with a Jewish character. And historic Palestine, because of Jews' very long-standing attachments to that space, and because of the fact that it's born in a world where all kinds of peoples and countries are going and trying to populate various places around the globe, right? It's born in the world of empires, but it's born of a group that is an oppressed minority in Europe looking for a homeland, looking for a safe space, looking for a place where Jews will know that they can be safe, and that in times of trouble, they can go. And so in this place that has such deep religious and historic significance for Jews, that's where the Zionist movement focuses its energy quickly. There are actually debates about other possible territories because a homeland is the fundamental need, but pretty quickly the consensus builds that it should be in historic Palestine. And, okay, thank you. So it's in 1948, after decades of Jewish settlement in Palestine, trying to build a society there, having more of an opportunity to settle there after the establishment of the British Mandate of Palestine after World War I, which on the one hand says that it supports the creation of some kind of Jewish homeland there, but also says that it doesn't want to disadvantage the Arab inhabitants of Palestine. So Britain is in a very kind of tenuous position of sometimes supporting the Zionist movement, but at the same time, frequently imposing restrictions on Jewish migration. So this struggle continues through the 20s and the 30s, but part of what's going on there is that hundreds of thousands of Jews eventually are migrating to Palestine and actually building up a society and sort of building almost like a shadow institutional, what will become government structure during this time. And it's becoming a more and more contested space with the local Arab population. In 1948, with the United Nations deciding to partition Palestine as Britain leaves, there is the establishment at the United Nations of a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state. Immediately after that, there's a war that's fought. At the conclusion of that war, Israel is able to establish itself as an independent Jewish state. And ever since. It's been a very important homeland for Jews, has spiritual, cultural, and political significance, and it has been a safe haven. There have been hundreds of thousands of Jews who have gone from places where their lives were in danger, and they were able to find safe haven in Israel. Now, we know that the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 also entailed the displacement of approximately 750,000 Palestinian inhabitants, Arab inhabitants of Palestine, from their homes, from their homeland, and the emergence of a refugee crisis. The circumstances are exceedingly complicated. Certainly, there were cases of Israeli expulsions, of deliberate attempts to intimidate people to leave. There were also lots of other circumstances under which people left in 1948. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But the outcome of the war is not only the establishment, obviously, of a Jewish state, it's also this refugee crisis, which the world still has not found a solution to this day. This is a great illustration of the fact that Israel has lots of areas where it can be criticized, historically and in the present. There are plenty of things about Israel or about Zionism that are open for critique and open for intense debate. And that's entirely legitimate. And you will find, if you talk to many American Jews, and even more so if you talk to many Israeli Jews, that that's where some of the fiercest criticism comes from. We're going to talk in a moment about what form that debate should or should not take. But the other element of the events of the founding of Israel and the years after it that's important, that sometimes gets forgotten, is several 100,000 Jews from Arab lands, from the Middle East, from North Africa, are forced to leave the places where their families have resided for generations. Sometimes they are expelled. Sometimes it's pressure campaigns. Sometimes it's more subtle. But over time, those communities are mostly emptied in the decades after 1948. And most of those Jews also go to Israel. It's a reminder of the diversity of the Jewish people and of the Jews of Israel. And it's unfortunately a moment where, for the first time, Jews in Arab lands in large numbers are forced by the Arab-Zionist conflict to no longer feel safe in a way that had not been true for Jewish communities in the Arab world historically before that time. I'm going to turn things back over.
Great, thanks, Ethan. And now we're going to get into some of these ideas, which there were questions earlier about this complicated aspect of Israel and how it feeds into some of the historical ideas of anti-Semitism. And one of the things I want to highlight that I know Ethan has shared before that I think is important is that Israel occupies a very unique and complicated way, the way that Jews do in society. Just the sheer name, the word Israel, the name of the country, pulls on the historical religious roots, as I mentioned earlier, right? We can't understand Israel without understanding the origin of the name. The name is a biblical name, one who is Jacob, right? Jacob's name. So already criticizing a country that has Jewish connections in just the name can already start off in a complex nature. It doesn't mean it can't be criticized, but as Ethan said from the outset, context and words are really important. And sometimes it means you have to change how we're using words and what words we use and in what context we use it. The other thing that I think is also very important to note that Ethan has shared before is that Israel, the foundation of Israel, arose in 1948 as a colonial enterprise. As much of that time, many countries did at that time. It was a product of what was happening at that time. And the complex nature, it was also a national liberation of a group of minority people that were looking for a place of saving. So it's complicated. It was, yes, a colonial enterprise, which is accurate, and yes, a national liberation of people that are being persecuted. I only say that to just throw more complex nature when we then move into the issues around Israel. So when we look at Israel and criticism of Israel is totally fair game. There's nothing wrong with criticizing the policies, actions. There is plenty of wrongs that Israel does. I will say there are plenty of policies that I find reprehensible. That is fair game like any country. policies are fair game. Similar, anti-Zionism. There is opportunity, and we say this is anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitic. It can be anti-Semitic, but as Ethan has shared earlier, context and understanding of how the word is used is critical to evaluate if it is anti-Semitic. I will say many times anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, but there are times that it might not be. And another form of that is not anti-Semitic, I will say not anti-Semitic, and I say this as we get into some more complex and I would say more difficult, sticky issues. Ethan and I are speaking from ourselves. There will be Jews and academics that would potentially disagree with us, but we're offering what we'll say is, I think, somewhat normative and somewhat accepted ideas of what the normative Jewish community might understand this as. The support of a Palestinian state, Palestinians' rights to self-determination, not anti-Semitic. That is full well. The people, you'll have many Jewish groups that talk about 2 states for 2 people. There is nothing about that. Pressuring or lobbying or Israelis standing up to say that Israel should retreat to certain borders and establish a state for Palestinians. That is all fair game. In fact, this sign here this picture that we're looking at is an Israeli protest that says that they are against the occupation of Israeli lands. Jewish Israelis that say the occupation after 1967, we don't think we should have it. That is all fair game. And I would say you can say that, you can critique those policies, you can critique policies of treatment of or the mistreatment of Israeli Arabs within Israel. All of that is fair game. So when does criticism of Israel move into anti-Semitism? And this is where it can get sticky. And this is where I think sometimes there's unique things with Israel that we have to understand. And this is where the context and the history and the historical tropes of anti-Semitism become critical to evaluating things. So here's a couple examples. Using images that are associated with classical anti-Semitic tropes to describe Israel or Israelis. So some of those tropes that we might have, Zionist power. You can already hear some of that Zionist power referencing this idea of Jewish power, Jewish conspiratorial ideas. Or another one is the Zionist lobby, right? This is about harking on these ideas of a Jewish power, where Zionism is just code word for Jewish. Another one is Jewish influence for Israel. All of these things are harking on this idea of Jewish power that is conspiratorial in nature. Another significant idea, comparing Israel to the policies of Nazi Germany. So we have this one exact example. You have the Israeli flag, the person holding up the drawing of the Israeli flag, taking out the Star of David. I will say that I think there's 2 pieces in here that could potentially have anti-Semitic tropes, one of which is the swastika, which is now used today, specifically about Nazi Germany and the Third Reich, is replacing that, using that to critique the policies of Israel. And just a couple other ones that I think are important just to name: denying the Jewish people a right to a state, saying the Jews don't get a state, but Palestinians get a state, or the Kurds get a state, or other national groups get a state. So denying the rights of Jews, but not somebody else. Now, could you say, this is where sometimes we might get into an idea of anti-Zionism might not be anti-Semitic. If I believe in there is no such thing as a state, no people should have a state, I am equally against this idea of statehood, Jews, Palestinians, Kurds, whatever, that then begs the question, you know what, you're being equal at your assertion that you might be able to say, yeah, that's probably not anti-Semitic, right? We could take that to extreme. But particularly saying that Jews do not deserve a state and other ethnic groups do, that reeks of a sense of a difference between Jews and other groups. Asserting that a Jew, because they're a Jew, are accountable for the actions of the Israeli government. And this is something that happens, I will say, a lot more on campuses, specifically with students, is a Jewish student meets their friend in a dorm room, somebody new, that new friend in the dorm room finds out that they're Jewish, and they say, "Oh, can you explain to me why is Israel so awful to Palestinians?" I feel like, can you answer that? That is anti-Semitic. Holding the actions of the Israeli government, holding a Jewish student accountable to describe or answer why the Israeli government makes a decision or an action, whether or not the action we find reprehensible or not, but holding that Jew accountable is anti-Semitic. Another one is disqualifying a Jewish person because they're associated with Israel. Saying to a Jewish student, you cannot be in my club because you're associated with Israel. That is inherently anti-Semitic. It means that the student has to let go of part of their identity in order to be part of something. And again, context can be important. If it's a group about a specific political thing, might we say, oh, that could be possible? But this is disqualifying a Jewish person because they happen to be associated to Israel. Asking a student to denounce Israel or Zionism to be part of a group. We've seen this sometimes on campus, in campus politics and campus government. A student is running for maybe student body president or student senate, and students will say to them, you have to denounce your connection to Israel and Zionism if you can run. That's asking a student to let go of a part of their identity in order to join a group. That is inherently anti-Semitic, and we shouldn't. As we know, we should be adopting, we should be allowing students to bring their whole selves and their full identities. And then another one that is also, that happens on college campuses, is asking students to disassociate themselves, not necessarily with Israel, but from Jewish organizations that also have a strong connection to Israel. Saying to a Jewish student, you cannot be part of this club unless you choose not to participate in Hillel, or you choose not to participate in the Jewish Student Union. That is inherently anti-Semitic. And it's couched under the idea of, I disagree with Israel's policies and all of this, and by being part of that, you are supporting those policies. It lets go of any nuance or opportunity for a student, a Jewish student in particular, to say, I am deeply in relationship with Israel and all of its complexities, and I find this policy reprehensible. I support this. This brings meaning to me. This is something that I struggle with. What it does is it limits the Jewish connection to Israel in a very binary way. Israel does things I don't like. If you're part of that, you have to denounce it because you're Jewish. All of those things are a basis of how the Israel conversation leads into some of the anti-Semitism. And I will say many times that I hear from students that many students that will use some of this do not actually understand that they are being anti-Semitic in their nature, that they are using certain things of ideas of, I disagree with this, you need to either expunge yourself of that or relinquish yourself of that if you want to become part of our group. And the difficulty with Israel and Zionism is it's part of the Jewish identity because it is part of a manifestation of who they are. The example that I'll give is that for a Jewish student, sometimes wearing a particular shirt in Hebrew or a representation of Israel is not necessarily a manifestation of a support of Israel, but it becomes an expression of their Jewish identity. It is a place that that the language of Hebrew is spoken. It is a place that the calendar is one of the Jewish calendar. In fact, right now, no work is done in Israel. You can't get anything done right now because it's Passover, right? That is part of the amplification of what a Jewish state is for that Jewish student. It's not necessarily about a particular policy. So now we're going to, one thing that we're going to do right now is we're going to break up into, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to, just to bring us back a little bit, is that anti-Semitism is unique in what we'll say is some of the other different, it operates differently than other hatreds. Jews are possibly the only group, they face discrimination and hatred. They are a minority. We saw the population, it's a minority of people. And yet they do have overrepresentation in places of power. So those are two things that work in tension, and it actually feeds on a trope of power. There are more Jews in the US in government representative of the number of Jews that exist in the US. Right? There are 2%, the population of Jews in the US is about 2%. Those two things are true. So we have to wrestle with that. That's a unique opportunity. I look at UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley has roughly 10% of the population identifies as being Jewish. Those are just two facts. That complicates the nature of anti-Semitism today, especially when one of the tropes of anti-Semitism is about the idea of Jews having power and conspiratorial power. The other part of Jews is that anti-Semitism is not part of the rubric and the lexicon of structural racism. It isn't part of the conversation that we have today, where anti-Semitism is not part of currently that structural racism. That structural things that existed in terms of policies of Jews in different clubs or quotas, that no longer exists. That's been changed. So that being the case it is, and as I say here, is that Jews are not impeded from the opportunities, unlike many other ethnic groups that exist. And in some ways, we're seeing is that structural racism, right? It was part of a feature of anti-Semitism, and today it actually is not. So that complicates things. When the language of hatred and racism is one of structural racism, we may think of take out anti-Semitism, when in fact, anti-Semitism is part of it. It just doesn't fit into the language and the lexicon of structural racism. And in particular, college campuses today, students as a whole are speaking in the language and are tuned to the ideas, I will say in a positive way, to the idea of structural racism that exists. And what ends up happening when we're only focusing on the structural racism, which we should be focusing on, and we exclude groups or exclude Jews from that, again, what happens is that we talk about racism and we exclude anti-Semitism because it might not fit into the same qualities that we're talking about in terms of racism. And the idea is that anti-Semitism, it's unusual, right? It may be the only singular group or hatred that exists on both ends of a political spectrum that can sometimes be sandwiched, and depending on your viewpoint, you can pick which one you want it to be. And I'll just give a quick sense. Someone was saying about numbers. Anti-Semitism, I will say, is it's at a height. In some ways, it's anti-Semitism and acts have been, people have been emboldened. Whether or not it's on a rise, certainly more incidents have been reported. But as a whole, people are feeling more emboldened. It's becoming more acceptable to use these tropes. And you just see, these are just some of the statistics from the Anti-Defamation League. It is on a record numbers of anti-Semitism, both in terms of vandalism, harassment, attacks that have happened between the Poway Synagogue and Squirrel Hill Synagogue. It was the most deadly incidents of Jews in terms of attacks than I think ever in the history of the United States. So I'll just end with, and then we'll move into Q&A. What's next? What do we do? One of the most important things is there is an opportunity to file complaints and a bias complaint online. If we see graffiti, if we see flyers, if we see signs, to be attuned to that. The other thing is just to encourage people to stand up, to ask a question, to probe people, ask from a place of inquiry, to make sure that people understand how comments may or may not be anti-Semitic. Many times they come from a place of people not understanding historical tropes. And once we understand the historical tropes, we get a sense of why that might be anti-Semitic. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And at this point, open up the opportunity for some Q&A.
Please don't be shy. I mean, like we said, we really take any questions, any thoughts, and this is your opportunity. So ask what's on your mind.
Yeah, I guess I can just jump in. I mean, I from my limited point of view, or it feels like one of the more difficult things is the perception or how people react to how Israel is dealing with the Palestinian question, and we've talked here about how there's policy and how that that struggle to get get feel Israel is the bad guys. They're beating down these poor people. They push them out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I guess that's one thing. I don't know if I want to say I personally struggle with it, but I can almost understand how difficult that conversation is. I'm not sure that's a question. It's just kind of maybe open up to an idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, thank you, Jody. I think that's it is one of the hardest questions that a lot of people struggle with in this conversation. And I think the key is to sort of try to figure out a set of, wise guidelines for conversations about Israel and for when you want to criticize Israel. Adam and I both have many criticisms of the current Israeli government, some of them quite fierce. You could make a list of 500 criticisms of the Israeli government that are very fierce, and that wouldn't make you anti-Semitic. The question is, what kinds of terms are we using? Do we start talking about things like the Jewish lobby or Jewish power? Do we start demonizing Israel in terms that are far exaggerated from the way we talk about other countries? Do we use caricatures that remind us of anti-Semitic stereotypes, right? This is where we move into a dangerous area. Double standards, Adam and I believe that they are not in and of themselves necessarily anti-Semitic, because we all pick our fights. We all pick the things we care most about. So the fact that you spent more time talking about Israel doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic. But sometimes a very exaggerated difference between the way that Israel is being characterized and any other country is being characterized, we should be careful. And so I think, asking the right kinds of questions of people, if you're in a conversation and you're uncomfortable with where it's going, to try to say, why are we using that terminology? Could we use different terms? Do you feel strongly about this issue in terms of certain actions of other governments? And we can all think of examples, right? I think that can help to guide a more measured conversation. And we're really, when we go into that conversation and we know that anti-Semitism exists and that it's been a powerful and lethal force historically and that it exists today and what the stereotypes are, then we can be informed. And then we can argue, we can argue heatedly, but if we have that base of knowledge, then we'll hopefully take greater care.
I noticed there was a question in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and answer that. The question is, if anti-Semitism does not fit into understood discriminatory paradigm, are there any strategies or examples or analogies we might employ to better help students and colleagues or even family better understand? So I'll take a first stab, and then Ethan, you can add to that. I think the difficulty is there are very few analogies. I think that's part of the difficulty. For me, the part that I will say is it doesn't fit into the discriminatory paradigm. I think the question needs to ask is, we have to really understand, for me, this is why the historical tropes are really critical. We have to fully understand where something is coming from. So is a statement, we have to look at a statement and see where is it coming from? How does it hark possibly on tropes that may be anti-Semitic? And in that case, I need to then say something or change how I'm talking about something. I think we have to be careful about language in a way that we would normally, but it doesn't fit into the paradigm. And I think that's the complicated nature, is it doesn't fit in a box. And in some ways, Jews as a whole are so varied and look at things differently. It doesn't fit in this natural box as both, as I said, a religion and a nation. So what I would say is, I think to better understand it is to find out what a statement or an action is coming from, to then figure out, is this something, does it fit into an anti-Semitic trope or not? And I think, I guess I would caution trying to use a particular paradigm to try to define it. And I would more look at this and say, is this act something that may be anti-Semitic based on a trope, based on histories of Jewish experience? I don't know, Ethan, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so I agree with everything I've said, but I will actually offer out a little bit of what I think is, in some ways, there are, I think, some useful analogies that maybe are more familiar to us. One thing to think about is Jews are not unique in having a deep sense of having suffered persecution historically, and that conditioning the way that we interact with society and the way that we interact with certain tropes. We're in a different structural position, profoundly so, from African Americans. But as I've written a little bit about, right, Jews, like African Americans, carry with them a deep sense of historical consciousness about the history of anti-Semitism, the history of racism and persecution, and that affects the way we perceive certain things. So certain kinds of sensitivities that come out in these conversations can sometimes be well understood if we think about sensitivities that are more sort of instinctive and natural to us, that we know about when we look at a context where structural racism is very persistent, like the African American experience. The Asian American experience has certain analogies also, I think, to the Jewish American experience in terms of perceptions about overrepresentation in various areas of education and success, and sometimes being perceived as a group that doesn't face disadvantage. And we have seen horrific anti-Asian incidents in this country really over the last year that have been highlighted more in recent weeks. And those are incidents of hatred that often come from, misperceptions. They don't play out exactly the same way that we think about structural racism. They come from hatreds and stereotypes that have a long history themselves. So I think some of the hatreds that are around us that we're more familiar with do have certain ways that they can usefully help us think about components of the conversation about anti-Semitism.
I saw someone had a hand up on the Zoom. Is there a question?
Was there a question?
Yes, I had a question. Just in regards to what is considered, obviously we're talking about racism and anti-Semitic statements or treatments of people. Would you say it's equal across the board, or would you say certain cultures or nations or areas in which some Jews reside is more prone to these attacks compared to, let's say, U.S. or even South America, or even if you said in Asia, there's Jews as well. So would you say it's kind of regional, or is it kind of in general?
Do you want to go ahead, Ethan?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, first, for all the reasons we've discussed, we want to avoid generalizing about cultures, right? But I would say certain forms of anti-Semitism do have deeper roots in different places and even in different, political cultures and movements in the United States, right? I mean, we talked about ideas about white supremacy and white nationalism. They are not exclusive to elements of conservatism or the right in the United States, but that's where they typically reside. There's certain forms of anti-Zionism that, to the degree that they are part of American political life, they tend to reside more on the far left. In the Arab world, a certain kind of hostility toward Israel that spills over into a lot of anti-Semitic tropes about Jews, I think many times coming from a place of ignorance, that is surveys show it's more frequent. In parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, there is another form effectively of white nationalism that has a lot of stereotypes about Jews being, behind Jewish conspiracies, being behind various forces that they oppose. So I would say certain forms of anti-Semitism have become more part of different kinds of political cultures in different places.
I'll just add, it's hard, as Ethan strove to say, we don't want to generalize. I think where there is a unifying idea is there's this conspiratorial idea that is foundational to all of these ideas, to this whole concept. And regardless of where you are in the world, regardless of where you are on a political spectrum, the idea that anti-Semitism is in its heart a conspiratorial idea trying to put something forward. So that in and of itself, just like conspiracies can manifest in different ways in different countries and different cultures, it's not unique in any way. So I think it's hard to categorize certain areas are more prone than others. I think that in the same way that I would say racism of anything is not prone to a culture per se, it's prone to the peoples, and racism does not discriminate, hatreds do not discriminate, hatred can be used in any way. So I think it's hard to say that there's any uniqueness.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, just to be clear and add to what Adam just said, I wouldn't say that even what I just described is because those are more prone. There are very specific contextual reasons why certain forms of anti-Semitism are more prevalent in certain places and certain cultures.
Thank you.
Up in just a minute. I know you're going to give us a list of like educational resources just so that we can do additional research on, on our own. But I'm wondering if you know of any like scholars that perhaps take like a critical lens to this, because my instinct is to approach this from like a critical race perspective. And what I'm saying is like in a deeply white supremacist like society, your proximity to power is not a protection. You're the most vulnerable because you're an easy scapegoat, right? And so what you've been talking about when you talk about the uniqueness of, Jewish people occupying spaces of power is their proximity to power as we know it in a white supremacist system, similar to Asians. And so what we're finding is that in situations where this, of turmoil, your proximity makes you an easy target, right? And so I'm wondering if there are others who have done work in this field, because as we think about, we're part of the Office of EDI, and part of our job is like thinking of ways of like dismantling the systems that prevent access to minorities. But what you've highlighted today is that, getting up into the ranks isn't really going to protect you from anything, right? You're not safe because the system itself is like, a cult, and, the leader is white supremacy, right? And everything that like kind of stains it. So I'd be interested in learning more about that.
Ethan can probably speak a little bit of some of the scholarly work that might be there, but I think your point is really important to make. What I just want to highlight is it's something that Jews will sometimes not know how to navigate. And I think, Wendy, you articulated it exceptionally well, is that it is clear that there are Jews in a place of proximity to power, and recognizing that there are many Jews that are nervous about it. I don't know if they would articulate it as clearly as you did, Wendy, but they're nervous about it because of the historical ideas of knowing that there'll be a scapegoat being in that place. And we see that we've seen that actually mixes from from across the political spectrum. And I tell you, it manifests deeply among Jews, sometimes being embarrassed or being quiet of like, oh, don't talk too much, that like, oh, that Supreme Court justice is Jewish. Oh, we're not going to talk too much about that. That is rooted in exactly what you're saying, Wendy, is that it will cause somebody, and that in itself, just like you said, is in and of itself anti-Semitic, right? There's no reason that you should be, if a Jew is in the Senate, they should be fine. I'm Jewish, I'm in the Senate. There's nothing, or I'm part of this, or I'm part of this fight to dismantle X, right? It doesn't make a difference where that power is. So I would say that I think it's an astute observation. It's something that Jews in America, I think, struggle with for fear, of that deep fear. I don't know, Ethan would know about some of the scholarly work on that, but I think it is an important point, because just like I said, Jews as a whole are a minority. They are a minority, and they do occupy a place of overrepresentation in some areas.
Yeah, like Adam said, I mean, I think you articulated something really important exceptionally well. The scholarship is very absent by and large. There is a move. There's just very little interest, quite frankly, in critical race studies, broadly speaking, in anti-Semitism. I mean, I think part of it is not knowing what to do with it. It's partly relates to the politics around Israel-Palestine, where the natural move is to talk about Palestinians and the structural racisms against Arabs and Palestinians in Israel-Palestine, which is a legitimate issue, but it makes it even harder for people to figure out how to talk about anti-Semitism. There is a move in the scholarship on anti-Semitism to think more about anti-Semitism in conversation with other systems of discrimination. There was a good roundtable in the American Historical Review that I took part in 2018 that was really focused on new approaches to anti-Semitism. I wrote an essay there about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, historically interconnected hatreds. Someone else wrote about anti-Semitism and sexism against women. And so there is a move among a certain strand of scholars to try to think about anti-Semitism in this way. And there's a book coming out on anti-Semitism, basically critical theories of anti-Semitism, as the author calls it. And he's very familiar with critical race theory and really putting a lot of things together. But it's sort of a nascent field, and there are some real obstacles to thinking about it, as I think your question already acknowledged.
Thank you all. Be mindful of time. Thank you, Wendy, our newly appointed research analyst, for asking the important research question. Thank you, Dr. Katz and Rabbi Naftalin-Kelman, for starting us off in this very, very important conversation. Obviously, we're right at time because we could keep going on about this topic for hours. I appreciate you so much for kicking us off for this first Dialogues That Matter session. For folks in attendance, be on the lookout for that feedback survey in your email, especially being that this is the first part of our series. We're excited to hear feedback on how we can continue to improve upon it. And just as a reminder, our next event as part of our virtual dialogue series is on April 22nd with our own team at Law talking about how to help more Native American students move forward on the path to higher education. And I'll turn it over to Associate Chancellor Matos for any final closing remarks.
Thank you, Hala. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I always say you could be the final word, but Dr. Katz and Rabbi Naftalin-Kelman, I know this is not the last time we will see you. Thank you for the important work. Thank you to Vice Chancellor Nees for introducing us to you. And thank you to all of you for being in attendance. We will share resources. We're going to add that link on our website about learning more, Dr. Katz, from Berkeley, just so we can continue to uplift our community as transformative practitioners. And go ahead, you have the final word, Dr.
Sorry, but I remember now that Adam was going to have us share with you this event.
Oh, yes.
Very connected to actually the last question that Wendy asked. So give me 1 second. It's an event we're very excited about called Race and Responsibility, conversation about Black-Jewish relations and fight for equal justice. So I'll just put the link here for it. We've got really a fantastic lineup, and it's a collaboration among those of us working on anti-Semitism and a lot of people working also on other hatreds. So I'm excited about that. It's on April 12th. It'll be live streamed. So you're all very welcome. So I've just put that now in the chat.
Thank you. We will amplify the efforts, and a positive of Zoom life is we can attend a lot more things than we used to. So thank you for having us, and thank you for welcoming us. Enjoy your day as you reflect. We will send you those emails so you can continue to more. And I'll just close with the mission of our office is anti-oppression. So I think, sort of really talking about these as oppressive states and how we can bring the different intersections of our people and putting our people first is really important. So, hey, thank you for helping us do that. Have a wonderful day, everyone. I lift you up, and Dialogues That Matter.
Thank you.
Yes, that's right. The goodbye boxes. I've forgotten. Charles, thank you. Bye, everyone.